links to the oxalate toxicity Zoomcast that's now on the YouTube channel. It's long, sorry, it's exactly an hour. It's much longer than my usual videos, but still. And then the second one I put that's the osteoporosis one. Actually, let me just repost the osteoporosis video. That's roughly how I approach osteoporosis. It does have all the key components. If you check it out, again, we can talk about that more when I do the full wellness talk. Okay, so COVID-wise, I thought one of the more important articles that I've come across, it's basically highlights an importance of strong lungs and diaphragmatic training, so physical therapy for the lungs. So I'm putting this into the link. This actually is a link to something called Journal Watch, which I'm closely following every issue. And the article has been published. If you want a full article, you'll have to scroll down on that link and hit the link to the American Journal of Critical Care, Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine. So basically what they did is the patients who've had a stronger diaphragm had a lot better recovery, and also patients who got a physical therapy aimed at specifically lung strength, so to speak, did a lot better. It basically highlights to me an importance of this topic. We've been talking in our long COVID program quite a lot about the fact that at least half of all our patients with long COVID still have the subjective sense of dyspnea. So when they're moving around, they feel short of breath. That's what the word dyspnea means. And so clearly that this kind of pre-existing lung strength is what in many ways going to define whether you're going to have this symptom after the COVID or not. Now, the study, the patients all, of course, had very severe form of COVID. So it is an extreme example, but nonetheless, it's an important one. So what can you do to strengthen your lungs? Well, of course, you can work with physical therapy, which is what the study did, but I'm also going to give you some other ideas. So incentive spirometry is something that's been around for a very long time. The newer incentive spirometers are very sophisticated, and I'm going to show you just one. I'm going to put the link to kind of a more advanced system called the breather. Let me just put the link in the chat real quick. So these devices are often used by athletes for performance enhancement. Basically, they just like any other muscles, the diaphragm is a muscle and you can train it. You can train it by applying the exhalation against the resistance. And so you can teach your body to do that at the increased capacity, stimulating it more and more. In essence, you're just basically exercising it. So you're asking it to go against more and more load, more against more and more tension, thus making the diaphragm work harder and making it stronger. So check that out. If you're doing a yoga, and particularly if you're doing pranayamas, that's also very good, very old, very traditional method of lung strengthening. Musical instruments where you have to blow in any kind of engagement with that and any engagement with the voice, singing, for example, would be considered also, at least in part, lung training. And of course, endurance exercises, swimming, running, all of those things will help you to train your lung capacity. So that's all I have to say about that. Real quick then on the drugs and more drugs. So let me share my screen. And I will make a bit longer video about this topic. So if somehow you feel like I'm going to cover it very quickly, because I only want to take like a couple more minutes and then just do a minute or two of questions. So this is American Geriatric Society 2023 updated American HES Beers criteria. So what is Beers criteria? Back in 2011, Mr. Beers, now not to get confused with a can of beer. No, that's not. That's just the Dr. Beers, just his name. Came up with this concept that we should create a list of medications that is inappropriate for people over 65. The concept took off very quickly within the field of geriatrics, but very slowly outside of the field. This, if you look at the medications here, and I'll have to do something kind of funny. I apologize for that. There's a reason why I did that. This is the reason. So if you look at the classes of these medications, they divide them in a variety of different categories. So antihistamines, antibiotics, hard drugs, blood pressure medications, arrhythmia medications, etc. So I'm going to pause over here at the list of what's called benzodiazepines, and we're going to talk about this in a second. But so the principle goes like this. If we know that the medication has more chances of harming you than giving you any benefit, or when an alternatives are much safer and readily available, this should be not prescribed, at least not as a first line, ideally not at all. And because of that, the particular medication or class ends up in this Beers criteria. The biggest problem is that, so these are the medications on this list that kill about 250,000 people a year on average. And of course, about 80% of those people 65 plus. So this is why this was created as a national standard to try to deprescribe or remove medication of prescribing list. Of course, there are problems. Let me give an example. The benzodiazepines often prescribed for anxiety, and often the substitutive medications may not be effective enough, or they just may not work as well. So alternative methods to medications are often not even described or not even talked about because, you know, we are, the way the practice in the United States is set this way. What you're seeing here is the class. You're seeing what to do. In this case, it's just straight avoidance, no alternatives, just pure avoidance of the entire class. And then the degree of evidence is moderate and the recommendation is strong. So the degree of evidence is mild, moderate, and strong, or high. And then for the strength of recommendation, it's basically weak, moderate, or strong. I want to show you a couple other medications, which, so anyway, if you're over 65 and you're taking one of those drugs, the point is the American Geriatric Society says you shouldn't be taking it because it's dangerous for you with no benefit. So, or benefit does not come close to the potential of harm. So not enough benefits of it, basically, that's what it means. I want to show you a couple other medications which may be a little bit less known for you, and then we'll finish there. So this one, so there are some controversies here. So desiccated thyroid and medications like an Armour, for example, or Nature Thyroid are on this list. And the reason is because safer alternatives do exist. So basically Synthroid or just the synthetic forms of thyroid medications. Now, of course, a lot of my patients on this drug, this is one of the very few medications on this list that I actually disagree with, because I think the main reason this ended up here is simply because there are so many other thyroid medications that they felt like, let's not give it to them, to older adults, because it's harder to use them. I kind of agree with that. It's much harder to regulate the dosing of these medications, but when it's done slowly and appropriately, they could work and be safe. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and we'll take a minute or two for questions. And let's add it and at 2:15 to give 45 minutes for Aliza to do her part. And by the way, questions don't have to apply to either of these topics. If you have a particular COVID burning question, by all means. Thank you, Suzanne, for check out stasis.life for breath training. How do we get the list? Very good. So I'm going to put your link here in a second. I will definitely record a video. I was actually recording a video just before on this topic and I forgot to unmute the mic. So I had to redo the whole thing. I apologize. Oh. Otherwise, I would have given you a link to my YouTube channel with this. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a list to the actual American Geriatric Society actual journal, So that's probably the easiest. But then, of course, once I record the video, I'll give you. One of the important points is that table that I showed you. There are some versions of that table that is much more simplified. So you don't have to scroll through many, many pages, but you can scroll to 2 or 3 pages and get through the list just to make sure you're not on any of the medications that are on this list. And if you are, you should definitely talk to your doctor about getting off of them. So it's a good question. If you're taking a med says to relax. Yeah, so that's a little different. So most of this intake is considered towards the continuous intake. So if you're taking this pill once, then of course your risk is going to be a lot lower. So it's quite different, but still, you still want to be aware of that. You want to know that these medications are concerning. But yeah, Linda, I don't think that's applicable to this situation because you only take one pill. I think any chance of addiction or side effects from one dose is going to be very, very low. Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. So I think with that, Janet, let's spotlight Aliza, and is there any oxalate test you trust? So it's actually, I think you should really look at the video because we talked about the test quite in an extensive, the sort of the value and pitfalls of the testing. So it's beyond what I can offer in 30 seconds here. So, and if you want, Linda, you and I can talk about this offline during our next consult. Thank you, everybody. You're muted, dear.
I always forget that part. So I'm going to launch into my topic, but I actually want to respond to that list of medication just from my own corner in doing mental health work and understanding and seeing more of the side effect stuff with the benzos, with the benzodiazepines, and how problematic it can be, and the need to really support more integrative methods, right? Like good nutrition, good exercise. It's like we joke sometimes within the field, if everybody would like eat well and exercise regularly, we'd be out of business, right? So that those integrative methods, body support, acupuncture, massage therapy, there are so many sound treatments, but I'm hopeful that the paradigm within the mental health field in particular is going to shift more and more, continue to shift to more integrative methodologies for treatment. And we're really just kind of on the ground. We're seeing how problematic some of these medications really can be. Okay. So thank you. I'm going to talk today a little bit about attachment theory and applications. And I've given this workshop modified versions of it to different audiences, including teachers of really, really young kids in like inner city settings, kids who have actually been exposed to some significant levels of trauma. I've given this workshop to parent groups also who are dealing with anything, anywhere from infants to toddlers all the way through adolescents and actually older adolescents. And of course, couples. I do couples work also. And attachment theory, there's also been criticisms and legitimate ones, and it needs to kind of expand beyond some of its original structure. I think if we can understand some of the fundamentals of attachment theory, we can really understand some of the fundamental glue that kind of holds us in relationship and actually in a way kind of holds our place in the world, right? I'll just mention this attachment theory. We're really going to be focusing interpersonally, so interpersonal relationships. There are also applications, even there's terminology like ecological attachment, right? How we attach and connect to nature and our environments. That's significant also. So I always start by kind of a location of self, and some of you are familiar with me. I'm familiar with some of your faces and names at this point as well. Location of self. I am a relationally focused therapist, and one of my primary interests and callings is really in bonding, understanding and supporting human bonds and relationships. So I do a lot of family work. Okay. I have worked in school settings, outpatient mental health settings. I have done in-home interventions, crisis work, end-of-life palliative care settings, as well as private practice settings, both individual and group. I believe and am centered in an embodied approach to therapy and healing. It doesn't happen just in our brains, it happens in our whole bodies, which includes somatic training. And a large part of this workshop today actually stems from some of my training as a somatic attachment therapist, okay, which integrates somatic experiencing, a lot of Dr. Peter Levine's work, with attachment theory, more modern attachment theory. And finally, that little piece of the non-dual Kabbalistic healing that I know can be a mouthful sometimes, a non-dual approach to therapy and healing mentioned before, really has to do with us all growing and healing together. I'm sitting in the seat as a therapist, right? But we're in relationship and healing together, and holding opposites in particular, but holding different aspects of self and reality in deep relationship. And that's where I believe the healing happens, is when we take fragmented parts and we hold them in relationship, right? We could think of that in terms of our inner relationships, like when a part of me might not be talking to each other, right? There might be a protective part of me and a very seeking part of me, something that's yearning for something and wanting something very badly. Those parts might be in battle with one another, or they might be able to be in more of a relationship with one another. They can talk to each other and inform each other, right? That's how do we open our, to be really concrete about that, how can we open ourselves to relationship while being careful and maintaining really healthy boundaries at the same time, right? Protecting ourselves and remaining open-hearted, okay? And of course, between people, right, we can think of that deeper relationship. How do we both honor self and make room for other? We see that in a very particular way in couples dynamics, right? Sometimes it can feel like a me or you, and we want to get to the me and you. And parent-child dynamics, I mean, really any close, intimate relationship, we can see challenges and opportunities for that. So I'd also like to bring in some intentionality, kind of objectives, if you will. I'd really like to introduce attachment strategies, okay? Different attachment strategies. I'll mention secure, anxious, ambivalent. Those are considered the synonymous, avoidant, and disorganized. I see folks are writing these down, which is absolutely, great and fine. I want to say I've given this workshop doing slides and showing the PowerPoint, and I actually started to veer away from that because it felt less relational in an unhelpful way, where it becomes about kind of more the intellectual piece only of, kind of writing it down and that. And this is really interpersonal, actually. This is a transmission and exchange. So I'm happy to come back to terminology, but I also want to say, don't worry too much about it. I just like folks to get a sense of the different shapes and forms attachments and connections really take. Okay. I'm going to talk about attachment strategies, stances, and styles. I think most of us are more familiar with attachment styles, but what I really want to emphasize is how that comes to be and what that actually means, right? an attachment strategy kind of starts out, it's an adaptive strategy, and then over time can evolve into a default mode, or what we call a style, which I'll come back to. Okay. I'm going to also walk folks into some resourcing and orienting, which I've done before in this group, and I'll do it not as in depth, but kind of briefly, so we can actually take into our bodies a little bit more about what we're going to talk about with attachment. And finally, I want to talk about 3 modes of regulating ourselves, really important. When we are dysregulated, or, you know, a dysregulated child is the one who's tantruming, right? And we've all felt dysregulation as adults also, like losing it, okay? Whether we do that behaviorally or just kind of internally might shatter. How do we come back to regulation, equilibrium? We talked a little bit about breath, actually. How do we come back to more even breath instead of constricted breath? Okay, and the 3 modes of regulation are called auto-regulation, co-regulation, and self-regulation. All important, and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to invite folks to take a breath, not just metaphorically, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Okay. And just kind of briefly, I'm going to invite you into some resourcing and orienting. Resourcing is beginning with noticing what is already okay within us, our own resource. And orienting is an invitation to take in the present moment and kind of locate ourselves in our surroundings, right? So we're internally resourced and externally oriented. We're held in a way. So to put this to practice, folks can just take in a few breaths, taking a few breaths, eyes closed or open, whatever feels right for you. And you can just take a real brief inventory. You can notice 1 or 2 things, what already feels okay. I'm noticing in the moment, you know, it feels good even to be held by my chair. I have this nice netting here that feels good on my back. I feel okay there, yeah. Okay, maybe my shoulders are relaxed. If you notice some tension, that's okay. We're just going to come back to some of the resource and focus on what feels okay or even good within us. And briefly, again, this is brief. This could be a much longer exercise. Also, as you've oriented yourself in some of that resource, then we're going to switch to some of that orientation in our environment. So when we kind of look around or even feel into the room, what helps us feel supported, located, held in a way? I like to look out the window. There's a farm behind my house. That's very orienting for me. The green right now, that open space, can also be something inside your space. I've got some nice little paintings. I have some Mother's Day cards to my kids. That's orienting. It could be anything, a color of paint on the wall, for example. Okay. So really honoring this embodied sense, feeling resource within me and feeling oriented in my environment. Okay, and this being a location we can always come back to. we're ready to talk a little bit more about some of the attachment stuff. And the reason I like to resource and orient when we're talking about attachment stuff is that we all have attachment wounding, right? We all have things that challenges we've faced in our earlier lives, conscious and unconscious. This is part of human experience. Okay. You know, there can be trauma histories that can come up, and really important that we feel able, when we're feeling some of that stuff, able to come back to our own resources and our own orientation. Of course, in this group and out there in the world, in life, this is a helpful tool. It's very helpful and fruitful to explore wounding, but in the right context with the right support. Oftentimes, perhaps in more individual therapy or couples work, family work. Okay. So please feel free to come back to your own resource and orienting as we're talking. Okay. The 3 modes of regulation: co-regulation, auto-regulation, and self-regulation. Really helpful to know when you're feeling distressed. Might want to check in with myself. What am I needing here, right? What kind of regulation am I needing? Is it co-regulation? Do I need help from somebody else? Do I need to talk to a friend or a guide of some sort? A therapist to help me come back to equilibrium? Co-regulation can be something like breath work with somebody else or helping you. Okay, so the regulation happens interpersonally and interpersonally neurobiologically, like our neurobiological systems they're working together. Okay. And if we're seeking co-regulation, we want to seek it from somebody who's regulated themselves. We see barriers to this we see it in couples relationships, of course. If one is dysregulated, needing help from the other, and the other one's dysregulated, folks need to take turns being the speaker and the listener, okay, holding space and being held in space. Parent-child interactions. If there's a child tantruming and that parent is triggered, they really can't help that tantruming child until they come back to their own internal regulation. I'll mention some polyvagal theory stuff is really helpful here. In terms of identifying some of the dysregulated states and then using tools to come back to regulation. Maybe we could do a talk on polyvagal theory another time. Okay, so that's co-regulation. Auto-regulation, we all know this one. I know I do really well. That's when we do something to distract ourselves. Okay, it could be anything from watching maybe a program or a video of some kind just to distract ourselves. It could be some music, or could be some exercise. Something that helps us distract ourselves from what's feeling distressful in that moment. Again, these are all helpful and adaptive. Any one of these overused can be less helpful. We want to be able to access all 3 at the right times. Okay, so doing something else, distracting oneself. And then there's self-regulation. which we talk about a lot in mental health, self-regulation tools. What that really means is actually metabolizing what's going on. It's more of that integration, right? When we metabolize, we're integrating our whatever we've ingested, our food, taking in what we need, letting go of what we don't need. So the self-regulation is more of that feeling into my feelings. And we really need that resourcing and orienting in order to do that. If we don't have a foundation and a base, we can't get into the hard stuff. We can't, because we will shatter. We won't be able to tolerate that, right? And sometimes if we're in a self-regulation place, really feeling something hard, something difficult, we might need to titrate it, slow down a little bit. Maybe we'll need to take a break and come back to it. Auto-regulation, co-regulation, a little distraction, talking to somebody else, and then come back to it. That self-regulation place, again, is where that integration really happens. Okay. Remembering we need all three strategies. Okay. So the attachment system, all right? We've got our regulation strategies, we've got our foundation and resourcing and orienting. Let's talk about the attachment system and kind of what that is, how it develops. The attachment system is a threat response system. We need it to survive. We're not just talking about thriving here, we're talking about survival. Right? You think about where attachment is formed in early development, you've got these entirely 100% dependent infants. They have to rely on their caregivers to survive. So depending on temperaments and environment, some kind of shape needs to form between that infant and that caregiver, right? What is that connection going to look like? So how we attach and connect is part of our inherent design to survive. I'll side mention some of this stuff does get into object relations theory, which I won't go so far into, but that we're basically, it's our nature. We're born into this world, right? What's called object seeking. We're born into this world with some kind of what I think of like a internal knowing. It's our nature, right? That we aren't alone and we can't do this alone. So we are seeking other. We're looking for other, right? That's the baby seeks the breast right away. That's an instinct. And in order to survive, we adopt these adaptive strategies, again, according to our circumstance and temperament. What's available to us. And this is my hope in this material when I do these workshops, is that we actually develop a more compassionate consciousness in some attachment challenges, right? Where a person might kind of shut down and struggle with that or get really anxious. We can understand a little bit more of the origin of that. I think we can be a lot more compassionate, both with ourselves and other people. So these adaptive strategies, okay, they start out as it's a strategy beginning, become stances. We have like muscle memory of doing things in a certain way, then become attachment styles, which are kind of our default modes. There are preferred modes of attachment, where we see that kind of presenting sometimes as a challenge. We'll get into the definitions of these, where you have maybe in a couples dynamic, one person might have what we call an avoidance strategy, where when they're distressed, they want to like shut themselves in their like office or work, for example, and not talk about anything. And you might have somebody who's got more of an anxious style, who wants to talk about it, who needs the other person to kind of like regulate. So what do you do in that situation? There might be conflicting styles. The compassionate stance, again, is, whoa, it's not that one is right or wrong, right? It's that these are their adaptive strategies. How do we hold space for both of those and help them come to a place where both of their needs are met? Maybe not simultaneously, but the needs are acknowledged, held, and met. And attachment involves both expressive and receptive skills, meaning it's an ability to seek and express as well as receive and take in. You think about that like a puzzle piece, and I don't have my little props with me right now, but a puzzle piece, there are the pieces that stick out, and then there are the pieces that are inverted. And that's what attachment is. We need both, kind of the seeking and receiving. How would I do that with my hands? Kind of whatever. You get the idea. Picture a puzzle piece. Secure attachment strategies. What do those look like? Secure attachment strategies have more to do, if you're looking at earlier development, you'll see low avoidance to people that we care about, just lower anxiety with caregivers. These are generalizations, but generally with more secure attachment, there's more of an ability to come back to equilibrium after experiencing distress, right? We see maybe with some children separating from caregivers, maybe they're going off to preschool, or they're with a nanny or babysitter. With more secure attachment, generally, that baby might be able to come back to an equilibrium after that separation a little bit more quickly. Okay, these are generalizations. Of course, it depends where that infant might be in development. Our attachment styles are said to develop by about 18 months. And it doesn't mean that we don't grow and evolve, but we've kind of got like a basic shaping that early. Here is what I think, an actual hopeful measurement about secure attachment. To develop secure attachment, we need 38% attunement, which means about a third of the time, when somebody's trying to communicate something to us, right? The baby's crying and needs something, that we get it right 38% of the time. Oh, you look tired, or you look hungry, you seem upset, or you seem, really happy and excited about something, right? We get it on the mark. The rest of the time, 2/3 of the time, it's about symmetry and has more to do with the back and forth. oh no, you're not hungry. Okay, let's try something else, right? Maybe you just need to be held. Maybe you need to be read to. So think about that in our adult relationships, right? We don't have to get it right all the time. We can explain it to each other. Let's have a back and forth. Oh no, that's not right. Oh, okay, explain that to me. Help me understand. Right? Good therapy is kind of founded on that, right? It's not that a therapist is supposed to be some kind of, mind reader or know exactly what's going on all the time. There's deep relatedness and there's a back and forth. Okay, so that's secure attachment strategies, what that kind of looks like and feels like. Then the insecure strategies, we're going to start with avoidant, what that might look like, how that might show up. Stress level can be really high, but cut off from awareness. So a kind of muting or numbing or shutting down. So somebody could look kind of frozen in a way, or just sort of flat. We wouldn't know that they're internally very distressed, perhaps very anxious, but they are. There's an internal distress level. That's what can be confusing about avoidant attachment. Okay, avoidant attachment might be something along the lines of, oh, I'll just do it all on my own. Okay, and we all have some of these strategies, right? Our styles tend to be more of our default modes. Right, we could be securely attached and still have avoidant or anxious strategies, 100%. Okay, and we want to be compassionate with that, right? So an avoidant strategy, I like to think of it as more of a tendency to go inward. May have developed, there might not have been a lot of resource for somebody growing up, and maybe for really good reason. Okay, maybe both parents are having one parent, very stretched, and that child might have adapted some avoidance strategies, for example. Okay, people with avoidant styles tend to need a lot of patience and understanding. Can't push too hard too fast. They need time. Okay. And there can, again, even it can appear a little bit detached, dissociated. If somebody's in an avoidant mode, it might feel like they're not really in the room with you. And it might feel like that for oneself, who might have that strategy. Whoa, I'm really feeling kind of dissociated, like I'm not even here. So in relationship with avoidance strategies, again, that patience. If we've got avoidance strategies within ourselves, anything you can do to get back in your body is really helpful. Movement can be really helpful. If you're starting to dissociate or disconnect a little bit, get in your body. Okay? If you're sitting, even standing, doing things like a few squats, some light stretching even can help. Okay. And we've got some anxious strategies. Okay, anxious strategies can look like a preoccupation with maybe it's a caregiver in early childhood. Later in life, there can be a tremendous fear of letting a loved one out of your sight in more extreme examples, or even if somebody's going to take a trip. That's come up in my work where maybe a spouse is going to be traveling, and for somebody who's got a more anxious attachment history, it causes extreme distress for that person. And that also needs compassion and time and some working through. Okay, so what might be some helpful tools? Okay, what if you had sort of a set phone call every day while that person's away? That would be reassuring for an anxious attachment wound or style. Can feel a little clingy or needy because that person's anxious. This anxious attachment stuff is coming up. Okay. So what's a little bit counterproductive in a way, right? What that person is needing is reassurance. Sometimes that clingy stuff can actually push people away. So whether we're applying this to ourselves or someone we know, we want to keep that in mind. Oh, what they're actually needing is some reassurance. Let me give that to them. Okay. Or if I'm the one kind of noticing an anxious strategy within myself, you know what? Some of that anxious stuff is coming up. Maybe I could be really direct about what I need. Maybe I could verbalize that. Hey, I actually just I need a little bit of a talk. Do you have a few minutes? When can we talk? I need you to hold my hand right now. Okay. A lot of examples are coming to mind. I'm going to stop there, but there's so many examples of how these strategies can come up and how we can actually provide some reassurance and nurturing for ourselves and others. Okay. And of course, with anxious attachment, there's a high level of anxiety associated with not having needs met or not being tuned into. There's that compassionate stance. And resourcing and orienting very helpful when anxious strategies are coming up. Okay, how can we come back to what's already okay within us? How do we locate ourselves in our environments, right? Okay, I'm noticing time. I'm going to move through this and kind of summarize, leave a few minutes for questions. And I had another mind body practice to bring in today, which I'm not going to be able to do. It's a loving kindness meditation. And I hope to bring that in another time. We did a little bit of the mind body practice, but I won't have time to kind of honor it fully, right? I hope that's okay with folks. Finally, this disorganized strategy. This is where this was a later strategy identified in attachment theory. This is where there's a collapse of the attachment system, where it's kind of anxious and avoidant at the same time. It's like having a foot on the gas and the brakes at the same time. The way it can look in children is almost like wobbly, like, do I go forward? Do I go back, right? It's fearful and dependent on an attachment figure. So real deep understanding and compassion for anybody who might struggle with some disorganized strategies. There's a real shutdown happening there. Okay, so it can look kind of frozen or shut down. Now notice, it's interesting, external presentation doesn't necessarily indicate what's going on for somebody internally. So somebody can look a little bit frozen and be in an avoidant place, like kind of withdrawn. They might also be in a disorganized place where they want to approach and they want to also retreat at the same time. Okay, if somebody is in that shutdown place, they are not able to relate really. They need time. They don't have capacity to really take you in at all. They need to be held in that moment. They need the time and space. Okay. And really quickly, just to end on this note of regulation, after we've touched on some of these attachment strategies that then become styles, to come back to those three options, those three modes of regulation. Do we or that other person, do we need co-regulation, talk to somebody else, auto-regulation, or self-regulation? Is there capacity for self-regulation there and integration? Okay. I have time for a couple of questions. I've got the chat box open. If anybody had any questions or comments, I apologize. I feel like I didn't have quite enough time for that. Okay, does anyone have any questions, whether they want to raise a hand and just say it or put it in the chat box?
Can you recommend any resources to elaborate on this that would be appropriate for lay people?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Can you recommend any resources that would be appropriate for a lay reader or
Yes.
consumer?
Yes, yes. There is one awesome book called The Power of Attachment by Diane Poole Heller. Her focus is really in couples more, but it applies to anybody. She's a really wonderful, compassionate attachment theorist. And also Dan Siegel's work, he talks a lot about the interpersonal neurobiology stuff, but he's an attachment theorist also. I actually love the synthesis of what he brings in. And he's got a few books. So he does a lot of parenting stuff. You can look up Dan Siegel and read any one of his books. Yes, thank you.
Diane's name was Diane.
Diane Poole Heller, thank you. Janet put it up. I think, yeah, order any one of these books on Amazon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Linda. I have a question. I can't find the chat in my screen, so I'm going to just ask it. Do you find that there is positive movement if one person in a couple is engaged in this kind of reorientation and the other person is not, that there's a shift for both?
Absolutely. I think generally, you know, our locus of control is over ourselves. And when we do that healing work ourselves, I mean, there are dynamic shifts often, and sometimes it results in us also, you know, drawing important boundaries for ourselves that affect partners, but 100%, you know, starting with ourselves is really powerful. And ultimately, that's truly where our control is. And when we get into control with another person, it's not us, that's when we get into like controlling behavior. It's not as helpful, but yes, absolutely. Okay. Thank you to everybody. I know we're at time. I don't think, were there any other questions?
You know what this tells me, Aliza?
Yeah.
We need to have you come back.
Yeah, I know. I think there's just too much. You get into this stuff, you know, and there's too much.
We may have to just boot Misha and give you the whole hour. What do you think, Nisha?
That's okay. I'm bootable. That's fine.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. Misha, do you have anything to say before I explain why we're not meeting next week?
No, let's let people go. It's a beautiful Friday. Aliza, thank you so much for being with us as always. And yes, no, we're not doing anything next Friday, so we'll see you the week after, and Janet can tell us why.
Next weekend is the Memorial Day weekend, y'all. We just want a weekend off. So we will not be meeting. I will remember to send out an email to remind you all we're not meeting. And then in 2 weeks, please come back, bring a friend, bring a family member. As you know, we always have entertaining and enlightening lectures and mind-body practices, but Misha's right. Go out and enjoy this weekend. Bye.